In the middle of the 13th century, the world from China to the Mediterranean trembled under the thunder of hooves. For more than half a century, the armies forged by Genghis Khan and expanded by his successors had advanced with relentless precision. Cities that resisted were erased. Kingdoms that submitted were absorbed. From the plains of northern China to the forests of Russia, from Persia to the gates of Eastern Europe, the Mongols had demonstrated a terrifying consistency. They did not lose. Their victories were not accidents of savagery. They were the product of discipline, intelligence networks, mobile warfare, and an operational flexibility no settled empire could easily counter. They moved faster than rumor. They struck deeper than scouts could report. And they punished hesitation with annihilation. By the late 1250s, their attention turned decisively toward the Islamic heartlands of the Near East. In 1258, the Mongol prince Hulagu Khan led a massive expedition westward under orders from the Great Khan. His objective was not merely conquest, but finality. The Abbasid Caliphate, once the symbolic center of Sunni Islam, stood diminished but still revered in Baghdad. The Mongols demanded submission. The caliph hesitated. The result was catastrophic. Baghdad fell in February 1258. The city was sacked with systematic brutality. Its libraries were destroyed. Its population decimated. The caliph himself was executed. News of the catastrophe spread faster than any formal dispatch could carry it. For the Islamic world, it was not just a military defeat. It was a collapse of an order that had defined legitimacy for centuries. After Baghdad, resistance appeared futile. Hulagu continued westward into Syria. Aleppo fell. Damascus submitted soon after. The Mongol columns, reinforced by subject troops from across Asia, pressed toward the Levantine coast. Their advance now approached the frontier of Egypt. Egypt was no minor prize. Since the fall of Baghdad, it had become the most powerful remaining Muslim state. It was ruled not by an ancient dynasty, but by a military elite, the Mamluks. The Mamluks were former slave soldiers, mostly of Turkic and Circassian origin, trained from youth in cavalry warfare, archery, and discipline. Purchased, converted, educated, and militarized, they were an elite force built entirely around mounted combat. Over decades, they had taken power for themselves in Cairo. In 1260, their sultan was Qutuz, a figure whose rule was new, unstable, and contested. He had seized authority amid internal factionalism. Many emirs questioned his legitimacy. Egypt itself was not politically serene, and yet geography forced clarity. If Syria fell entirely under Mongol control, Egypt would be next. The Mongol armies were already probing into Palestine. Their commanders understood that the Nile Valley was both wealthy and strategically indispensable. In early 1260, Hulagu withdrew the bulk of his forces eastward after receiving news of the death of the Great Khan in Mongolia. Succession politics demanded his presence. He left behind a smaller but still formidable army in Syria under one of his most trusted lieutenants, Kitbuka. Kitbuka was no minor subordinate. A Nestorian Christian and a veteran of multiple campaigns, he commanded experienced Mongol Tumans supported by Armenian and Georgian contingents. Though reduced in number compared to Hulagu's original host, his army remained tactically superior to most regional forces. From the Mongol perspective, the situation appeared manageable. Egypt was divided. The Mamluks were newly consolidated. Their political structure was fragile. A demonstration of force might be enough to compel submission. Kitbuka sent envoys to Cairo. The message was not ambiguous. Submit or face the fate of Baghdad. The envoys likely expected compliance. Many rulers across Eurasia had calculated that resistance against the Mongols meant annihilation. But in Cairo, something different occurred. Sultan Qutuz convened his emirs. The Mongol threat was no longer theoretical. It had obliterated one of the greatest cities in the Islamic world. Submission might preserve lives in the short term, but it would reduce Egypt to tributary status. Its military elite subordinated to distant khans. There was also psychology at stake. The Mongols cultivated inevitability. They relied on fear as a strategic multiplier. Each city that surrendered without battle strengthened the aura of invincibility. Each massacre reinforced a lesson. If Egypt submitted, that aura would harden into permanent reality. Qutuz made a choice that few rulers had dared make. He ordered the Mongol envoys executed. Their severed heads were displayed at one of Cairo's gates, a public declaration that Egypt would resist. This was not bravado. It was a calculated political act. By killing the envoys, Qutuz eliminated any path to negotiated submission. He bound his own authority to resistance. He forced wavering emirs into alignment. The decision carried immense risk. If the Mamluks were defeated, there would be no mercy, but also clarified the strategic situation. Egypt would not wait behind the Nile's defenses. It would carry the war north. Within months, the Mamluk army began mobilizing. Among Qutuz's commanders was a capable and ambitious emir, Baibars. Baibars had already distinguished himself in earlier conflicts, including battles against the Crusader states. He understood Mongol methods better than most. He had studied their mobility, their feigned retreats, their coordination. The Mamluks faced a paradox. They were themselves masters of mounted archery, a military culture not entirely unlike that of the Mongols. Yet the Mongols possessed decades of campaign experience across vastly different terrains. They excelled at reconnaissance, deception, and synchronized cavalry assaults. To defeat them would require more than courage. It would require precision. As the summer of 1260 deepened, the armies moved toward Palestine. The region's landscape mattered. Northern Palestine was a mosaic of plains, low hills, and agricultural valleys. One location in particular would become decisive, a spring-fed plain near the Jezreel Valley, known in Arabic as Ain Jalut, the Spring of Goliath. It was not a grand battlefield by design. It was a natural corridor between the coastal plains and the interior highlands. Armies moving between Syria and Egypt would pass near it. Its water sources made it a necessary stop. Neither side sought a symbolic field. They sought advantage. Kitbuka advanced southward, confident that Mongol cavalry could overwhelm Egyptian forces. In open engagement, he believed the reduced size of his army did not negate its superiority. After all, Mongol forces had defeated far larger armies before. Qutuz and Baibars marched north with deliberate caution. They coordinated passage through territories controlled by Crusader states along the coast. The Crusaders, calculating their own survival, permitted the Mamluk army to pass unmolested. For them, Mongol expansion posed as great a threat as Egyptian power. By late August, both armies were converging. Across Palestine, farmers abandoned fields. Villages emptied. Rumors multiplied faster than scouts could verify them. The name Mongol still carried a near-mythical terror. Yet beneath that fear, something unfamiliar began to form. For the first time in decades, an organized, professional army was marching toward the Mongols not in desperation, but with intent to engage them deliberately. The psychological weight of that decision cannot be overstated. The Mongols had been the storm. Now, at Ain Jalut, the storm would meet resistance shaped in its own image, and neither side fully understood how much the world depended on the outcome. By the end of August 1260, the confrontation was no longer theoretical. Two professional cavalry armies, forged in entirely different political worlds, yet strikingly similar in military culture, were maneuvering toward the same narrow corridor in northern Palestine. The Mongol detachment under Kitbuka had pushed south from Syria, conducting operations with the confidence of men who had not known defeat. Their forces were smaller than the vast host that had destroyed Baghdad 2 years earlier, but they were hardened veterans. Each Mongol warrior was trained to ride for days without supply trains, to fire accurately from the saddle at full gallop, to operate within a strict decimal chain of command. They did not depend on brute mass. They depended on cohesion, maneuver, and timing. Opposing them was the army of the Mamluk Sultanate, led personally by Qutuz, with the experienced emir Baibars commanding key forward elements. The Mamluks were no feudal levy hastily assembled in panic. They were career soldiers raised within a rigid military institution. From adolescence, they had been trained in mounted archery, close combat, and disciplined formation maneuver. Their horses were conditioned for endurance. Their composite bows rivaled those of the steppe. Many had fought against Crusader heavy cavalry and understood how to counter shock assaults. Yet, facing the Mongols was different. The Mongols represented a mirror image, cavalry who could outmaneuver, outflank, and psychologically unsettle their enemies before a decisive strike. The terrain around Ain Jalut was not a featureless plain. It was a broken landscape of low ridges, scattered trees, cultivated fields, and the critical presence of fresh water. Springs fed the valley, making it an inevitable halt for mounted forces moving through the region. To the west lay routes toward the Mediterranean coast. To the east, pathways into the Jordan Valley. Control of this ground meant control of movement between Syria and Egypt. Baibars understood the importance of choosing where the engagement would occur. Open, flat terrain favored Mongol mobility and encirclement tactics. Broken ground, with concealed approaches and restricted visibility, offered opportunities for surprise. The Mamluk command made a deliberate choice. They would not simply meet the Mongols head-on in an unrestricted field. They would shape the battlefield. Baibars advanced ahead with a vanguard designed to provoke contact. His role was both dangerous and precise. He had to engage Kitbuka's forces convincingly enough to draw them into pursuit, yet avoid being decisively overwhelmed before the main Mamluk body could deploy. It required discipline under pressure. No premature collapse, no uncontrolled retreat. The Mongols had perfected the tactic of feigned withdrawal, luring enemies into disorder before reversing momentum with lethal coordination. Now the Mamluks intended to employ a version of that same strategy. Kitbuka's confidence likely stemmed from long experience. Mongol commanders were accustomed to enemies breaking once initial volleys of arrows disrupted formation. Their operational pattern was familiar. Advance and disperse formations, harass with missile fire, probe for weakness, then execute a coordinated charge once the opponent fractured. They relied on speed and psychological shock. Reports from scouts would have indicated that the Mamluk army was present in force, yet the Mongol tradition did not discourage engagement against larger numbers. Numerical inferiority had rarely mattered in previous campaigns. On the morning of September 3rd, 1260, contact intensified near Ain Jalut. Baibar's vanguard initiated skirmishing actions, launching arrow volleys and testing Mongol reaction speed. Dust clouds rose quickly, obscuring clear lines of sight. The air were filled with the sharp percussion of bowstrings and the low thunder of hooves striking dry ground. Communication across the field depended on signal flags, horns, and prearranged maneuvers. Once battle commenced, there was no central vantage point from which either commander could observe the entire field. Each relied on subordinate officers to interpret evolving conditions. Kitbuka responded aggressively. Rather than pause to conduct prolonged reconnaissance, he committed to engagement. His cavalry pressed forward, attempting to fix and break the Mamluk front before it could consolidate. Mongol units advanced in waves, loosing arrows with practiced rhythm. Their objective was disruption, forcing the Mamluk line to react defensively, to lose formation integrity. In many past battles, this opening phase had been sufficient to unravel opposing forces. But the Mamluks did not disintegrate. Their training held. Baibar's contingent began a controlled withdrawal. To Mongol observers, it may have appeared as the familiar pattern of enemy collapse. The vanguard yielded ground steadily, drawing the Mongol cavalry deeper into the valley. The retreat was not panicked. It was measured. Riders maintained spacing. Units fell back along predetermined paths, guiding pursuit toward terrain that concealed the bulk of Katu's main army. The psychological tension in such a maneuver was immense. A feigned retreat demands absolute trust and coordination. If timing fails, if reserves are not positioned correctly, the withdrawing force can become genuinely routed. Individual soldiers, under pressure from arrow fire in close pursuit, must resist the instinct to scatter. They must maintain the illusion of disorder without surrendering control. Kitbuka advanced further, committing more of his strength. Mongol doctrine favored decisive engagement once an enemy appeared vulnerable. The deeper they pushed, the more difficult disengagement would become if conditions shifted unexpectedly. Yet from the Mongol perspective, there was little precedent for caution. For decades, similar pursuits had ended in victory. At the critical moment, the Mamluk main force revealed itself. Hidden behind ridges and masked by terrain, Katu's army surged forward. Drums and horns signaled coordinated advance. What had appeared as a fragmented enemy suddenly reformed into a coherent battle line. Cavalry units struck from concealed positions, targeting Mongol flanks that had extended during pursuit. Arrow volleys now came from multiple directions, compressing the Mongol formation within the confines of the valley. This was a decisive test of adaptability. Mongol forces were not inexperienced with ambush or sudden reversal. They had executed such tactics themselves countless times. Kitbuka attempted to stabilize the situation, rallying his troops to counterattack rather than retreat. Mongol cavalry wheeled and regrouped, seeking to re-establish spacing for maneuver. Close combat intensified as distances collapsed. Lances and sabers replaced arrows in sections of field where formations collided. The confined terrain now limited Mongol advantages. Their hallmark encirclement required open space and synchronized movement across wide arcs. At Ain Jalut, ridges and vegetation disrupted those sweeping maneuvers. The Mamluks, familiar with the ground they had selected, exploited these constraints. Units struck at exposed segments, then withdrew before sustained counterpressure could mount. Casualties mounted on both sides. Horses, the foundation of each army's mobility, fell under concentrated fire. A dismounted cavalryman in such a battle was at severe risk. Dust thickened visibility to a few dozen meters in places. Commanders could not perceive the entire strategic picture. They reacted to fragments of information carried by messengers through chaos. At some point during the engagement, Kutuz is reported to have personally entered the thick of combat after removing his helmet to rally wavering elements. Whether symbolic or practical, such an act underscored the stakes. Leadership visibility could stabilize morale at critical junctures. If portions of the Mamluk line had faltered under Mongol counterattack, immediate reinforcement was necessary to prevent momentum from shifting. Kitbuka, for his part, refused withdrawal. Mongol tradition valued steadfastness in battle, particularly for commanders of high rank. Retreat under pressure risked unraveling cohesion. Instead, he pressed forward, attempting to punch through what he may have believed was the center of the Mamluk formation. The fighting became fragmented, clusters of cavalry engaging in brutal, close-range combat, units interlocking and separating amid continuous missile exchange. The equilibrium began to tilt as the hours passed. Mongol forces, extended from their initial pursuit, found themselves increasingly pressured on multiple fronts. The Mamluk reserves had not yet fully committed. Their timing allowed sustained reinforcement, while Mongol contingents absorbed cumulative losses. Coordination, so central to Mongol success, became more difficult as visibility, terrain, and mounting casualties disrupted communication. The battle did not end in a single dramatic charge. It shifted gradually, almost imperceptibly at first. What had begun as confident Mongol advance transformed into a struggle for stabilization. The Mamluks, having absorbed the initial assault, now pressed with growing cohesion. In the valley of Ain Jalut, the aura of inevitability began, for the first time in a generation, to fracture. By mid-afternoon, the rhythm of battle had shifted irreversibly. The Mongols, long accustomed to dictating the pace of combat, now faced the unfamiliar pressure of coordinated resistance. Every feigned retreat, every probing attack that served them so well, was met by a counterintuitive resilience that defied expectation. The Mamluk forces, anchored by Kutuz's steady command and Baibar's tactical insight, exploited the terrain with relentless precision. Low ridges and cultivated fields that had seemed incidental became instruments of strategy, constraining Mongol maneuver and exposing their formations to concentrated arrow fire. Units that had pursued with confidence now found themselves encircled, pressed from directions they had not anticipated, and forced into fragmented skirmishes rather than the sweeping cavalry maneuvers in which they excelled. Psychological strain compounded physical exhaustion. The Mongol soldiers, trained to expect submission or collapse in their opponents, now confronted an adversary whose cohesion did not waver under pressure. Commanders shouted orders over the roar of hooves and the metallic clash of weapons, attempting to rally disoriented Tumans. But the coordination required for effective counterattack was increasingly elusive. Signals were misread, reinforcements delayed, and the disciplined rhythm of the Mongol assault faltered. Amid the confusion, the Mamluks maintained their operational patience. Baibars, moving between elements of the line, directed strikes against the Mongols' flanks and rear, forcing repeated adjustments and overextension. The Mamluks did not simply react. They dictated engagement in microcosms across the battlefield. Arrows rained upon clustered Mongol contingents, disrupting bow volleys and preventing the simultaneous, synchronized movements that were central to Mongol tactics. In response, Kit Bukka attempted repeated counterattacks, but the constricted terrain and continuous harassment made coherent maneuvers nearly impossible. Mongol cavalry, stretched thin by pursuit, struggled to reform in tight spaces, and the initial confidence of their advance gave way to a defensive desperation. Small units found themselves isolated, fighting against concentrated numbers in localized skirmishes rather than executing the integrated assaults that had previously guaranteed victory. The psychological weight of the situation pressed on both sides, but in distinct ways. For the Mongols, the realization that their opponents would not break was itself a destabilizing force. Soldiers accustomed to witnessing the rapid collapse of enemy formations now faced a perplexing anomaly of coordinated resistance. Orders shouted across the din of combat competed with the instinctual fear of being surrounded or cut off. Each Mongol commander had to make instantaneous decisions with incomplete information, knowing that hesitation could be fatal, yet aggressive action risked further fragmentation. For the Mamluks, the stress was equally tangible but underpinned by opportunity. Discipline held. Units remained in formation. Reinforcements moved according to pre-planned schedules. The psychological advantage was subtle but decisive. The Mamluks could act with deliberate intent, while the Mongols reacted to unexpected resistance under duress. Every arrow fired, every feigned retreat executed with precision, increased Mongol confusion and gradually shifted the initiative into Egyptian hands. By late afternoon, the battle reached a crucial turning point. Kit Bukka's forces had extended too far in pursuit of the withdrawing Mamluk vanguard. Mongol units were strung out across the valley, separated by ridges, scattered fields, and rising dust. The carefully rehearsed cohesion that had underpinned previous victories was now fractured. Kutuz seized this moment. The bulk of the Mamluk army, previously concealed, surged forward in coordinated strikes designed to envelop and compress. Mongol formations, attempting to regroup, were caught in converging arcs of cavalry and infantry. Horses and riders collided in chaotic clusters. Arrows fell from multiple directions, forcing even the most experienced horsemen to fight dismounted or in constricted formations. Kit Bukka, confronted with this sudden envelopment, attempted to consolidate forces and execute a breakout, but each maneuver was anticipated, countered, and disrupted. The Mongol army, accustomed to dictating the flow of battle, found itself reacting to actions it could not predict. Command and control, once their greatest asset, became a liability under pressure of terrain, numbers, and timing. The collapse, when it occurred, was neither instantaneous nor spectacular in cinematic terms. It was incremental, a slow unraveling of cohesion under relentless, disciplined pressure. Isolated Mongol contingents began to fall back. Attempts to regroup failed as successive waves of Mamluk cavalry struck. Horses, exhausted from continuous pursuit and combat, collapsed under riders attempting to maintain mobility. Arrows continued to rain upon exposed flanks, and small pockets of resistance were gradually compressed and eliminated. Mongol soldiers who had survived earlier campaigns found themselves fighting in fragmented groups, cut off from leadership, and unable to execute the coordinated maneuvers that had guaranteed victory elsewhere. Kit Bukka, fighting in the thick of the engagement, was eventually surrounded. His death, when it came, marked not merely the loss of a commander, but the symbolic shattering of Mongol invincibility in the region. Once their leader fell, morale disintegrated rapidly. Retreats became routes, and survivors withdrew chaotically toward northern Syria. The Mamluks, while victorious, did not pursue recklessly. Their success was a product of deliberate planning, disciplined execution, and understanding of psychological pressure. They had drawn the Mongols into terrain that constrained their cavalry, maintained cohesion under fire, exploited overextension, and executed a tactical envelopment at the critical moment. Every decision, from the initial vanguard withdrawal to the timing of main force commitment, was calculated to exploit Mongol expectations and strengths against them. Casualties were significant on both sides, but the Mamluks preserved enough of their army to prevent immediate counterattack. By nightfall, the field of Ain Jalut was silent except for the groans of the wounded and the crackle of small fires, the remnants of a battle that had shifted the trajectory of history. The immediate aftermath had profound consequences. For the Mongols, The defeat shattered the myth of invincibility that had carried their armies across Eurasia. For decades, the narrative of unstoppable advance had been integral to their psychological warfare, instilling fear in rulers from Baghdad to Eastern Europe. The loss at Ain Jalut demonstrated that a determined, well-led, and strategically deployed opponent could exploit terrain, timing, and disciplined maneuver to defeat even the most feared cavalry in the world. Hulagu, far to the east in Persia, recognized the limitations of his forces without his personal command and halted further southward advance. The Mongol expansion into the heart of the Islamic world had reached its practical limit. For the Mamluks, the victory was transformative. It consolidated Qutuz's authority and elevated Baybar's reputation as a master tactician capable of adapting to the most challenging circumstances. Egypt's military and political structure, still fragile before the confrontation, gained legitimacy and cohesion. The psychological message resonated widely. The Mongols could be resisted. The battle inspired a reconfiguration of alliances and perceptions across the Levant. Crusader states, the remaining Muslim principalities, and neighboring powers now recalculated the balance of power, understanding that the Mongols, formidable though they were, could be contained. Beyond immediate military and political implications, Ain Jalut altered the historical narrative of the Mongol era. It was the first major defeat of a Mongol army in open battle, an event that reverberated across Eurasia. It demonstrated the interplay between strategic planning, tactical adaptation, and psychological warfare in medieval military operations. It underscored that even a force built on speed, mobility, and fear could be countered by disciplined training, careful selection of terrain, and anticipation of enemy behavior. Leaders such as Qutuz and Baybars exemplified the qualities necessary for this outcome: decisiveness under pressure, ability to coordinate complex maneuvers, and understanding the psychological dimensions of both their soldiers and the enemy.